If you're watching this video, it's because you just read something that gave you hope. And you know, you might be experiencing real hope for the first time in a long time, like most of the clients that we work with. You know, it's a funny thing when you start to have hope, because you immediately start to have skepticism, which is a natural thing, but it's also a good thing. And so I want to take a minute to encourage you to honor your own hope and to honor your own skepticism, because as we move through this process, you're going to have a demand rise up inside you for information, for truth, and for a distinct knowledge that your child has actually got a chance at getting better. And that's what we're here to help you with. In a few minutes, Jessica is going to talk about the science behind what we do and how it works on a very basic level, so that you have an idea of what's coming. You know, first, before we go there, I want to address something that I think is really important, which is that there's three things that neurodevelopmental disorders are not. So if you have a child with ADHD, Asperger's, autism, bipolar, depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, behavior problems, social issues, and a whole host of other symptom sets, the reality is that those disorders are not, number one, your child's fault. That's not what they're choosing to do. It's not something that they are even really conscious of necessarily. Or if they become conscious of it, they know. So many of our clients' kids say things like, it's something in my brain. I didn't know I was doing it, or I didn't mean to do that. And they don't know how to interact with their own impulsivity or their own awkwardness or their own just unconsciousness about the way their body is behaving and the way they're interacting with society, or the way they're acting with just family members and friends or school and teachers. So number one, it's not their fault. Number two, it's not your fault. And I know that kind of sounds cliche in this industry, but the reality is that it's not your fault genetically, and it's not your fault parentally, meaning there's nothing that you're doing or not doing that's causing your child to have these struggles or these issues. It might seem like sometimes you lose your temper, and so maybe you get frustrated, or you yell, or you have a parenting style that doesn't work very well with the idiosyncrasies of your child's difficulty. But that's not the cause of the problem, and you have to let yourself off the hook for that. The cause of the problem, as Jessica is going to talk about, is brain-based, and so not parent-based. And obviously you're never going to be the perfect parent, and if you are, then you need to write a book and you'll be a billionaire. But the third thing that we need to address is that these issues are not medical problems either. And because they're not medical problems, the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical interventions in general are a great Band-Aid. Lots and lots of our clients are grateful that they have the option of using medication to help their child get through the day, to get through school, to get through homework, and we're all good with that. I think everybody that does what we do has an understanding that it's a Band-Aid that sometimes you just got to use, but it's not a medical problem. And it's what that indicates or requires is that we say, if it's not a medical problem, then what is it? And that segues us to what we call a paradigm shift in understanding what is actually at the root of these types of problems. You know, the next thing that we need to talk about is the actual science. And Jessica is a world-class communicator and coach when it comes to understanding how the brain works and how to help parents understand how the brain works so that they can guide their child through the process that we do. So Jess, if you would, take us through it. And guys, get your notebook out. This is good stuff.
Yeah, so like Mike was saying, not a parenting issue, not a character problem in your kiddo. The real root of the problem for all neurodevelopmental disorders, whether that's ADHD, autism, Asperger's, sensory processing disorders, learning disorders, and everything in between, it all comes down to brain function. So here are a couple important things to understand about brain function that might help this make a little bit more sense for your kiddo. So first of all, the brain grows from the bottom of our skull to the top, and then the back to the front. So it develops that way by laying down layers, starting all the way down in the base of our brainstem, and layer by layer by layer by layer develops all the way up through our prefrontal cortex, which then controls everything from the top down, which is what executive function really is. So the very first part of our brain that develops is the brainstem. And I think this is really interesting. Humans are really only born with a functioning brainstem. We don't have much brain function outside of the brainstem at the time of birth, and that makes us very different than other mammals. So the brainstem is really primarily responsible for keeping our bodies alive: breathing, eating, sleeping, heart rate, digestion, function, just kind of keeping our bodies going for our first few months of life. But the other thing that the brainstem does is it has these things called primitive reflexes. So primitive reflexes are things that you've seen in a baby. You might have heard of them before if you've heard of like the Babinski reflex or the rooting reflex. Primitive reflexes are things, like I said, all humans are born with. They're good. They're necessary for survival. A couple examples of primitive reflexes that you've probably seen in a baby before. One really good example is what happens if you put your finger in a baby's palm. They always squeeze your finger, right? And that's not because they feel some deep emotional connection with you. It's a literal reflex. Just like if you go to the doctor and they hit your knee and your leg swings up, you have no control over that, right? Primitive reflexes are the same thing. They're a very different type of reflex, but with the palmar grasp reflex, there's a set of nerves that runs through the palm, and when you stimulate those nerves on a baby, it causes a contraction in their hand. We also have one called the rooting reflex. If you touch a baby's cheek, they're going to turn their head, open their mouth, and suck on whatever happens to be there. And that's how babies learn how to nurse. So again, primitive reflexes are good and they're necessary. But you and I hopefully don't do that anymore, right? If I touch your cheek, hopefully you would not reflexively bite down and suck on my finger. So we know, of course, that those primitive reflexes are supposed to start to go away at some point. That process really begins right around the 3-month mark, because now at the 3-month mark, we start developing sensory function and motor function. And this is the next level of neurodevelopment that takes place. So we have our brainstem with our primitive reflexes, and then we get sensory and motor, and then we have our visual cortex back here, cognition and executive function. So this new level or layer of neurodevelopment starts taking place, and those primitive reflexes start to go away. But I've been doing this for almost 9 years. How long have you been at this?
Almost 12.
So between the two of us, I think I can safely say, correct me if I'm wrong, I've never seen a child with neurodevelopmental disorders or the symptoms of them, diagnosed or undiagnosed, that did not have primitive reflex retention issues. So past that 1-year mark, when those primitive reflexes are supposed to go away, they're still present in children's brains that struggle with this whole range of neurodevelopmental disorders. So here are a couple ways to know if your child has retained primitive reflexes. If they have really poor handwriting, it's likely that they have a retained grasp reflex. If they chew on things often or are putting things in their mouth all the time, it's likely due to a retained rooting reflex. If they have poor posture, if they like to sit upside down, if they like to spin themselves excessively, if they like to swing excessively, if they get dark circles underneath their eyes, if they're really jumpy or easily startled or quick to anger, those are all excellent indicators, and we have another video that explains a lot more of the science behind those things specifically, but those are all excellent indicators that your child has retained primitive reflexes. So who really cares, right? Things like chewing on stuff and poor posture, I realize, are not what brought you to our website. So the issue that comes up when primitive reflexes don't get integrated properly is that means that the brainstem didn't develop the way that it was supposed to. And that layers concept that I talked about earlier is really important here, because like anything else with layers, if the foundation upon which we build everything else has some type of essentially a structural integrity problem, now every single layer that we try to build on top of that is also going to have issues. So it starts with really simple things like my kid chews on stuff and they're slouchy and they have sleep problems, but now we start developing sensory and motor and cognition, and also at these levels of neurodevelopment, the brain starts to split into 2 hemispheres. We've got a right side of the brain and a left side of the brain, and we start to really see some symptoms arise as we develop these next layers of neurodevelopment. So the left side of the brain is responsible for probably what most of your kiddos are really good at. The left side of the brain is responsible for very literal, logical thinking. The left side of the brain is really the gas pedal. So if you can't remember anything else about the 2 hemispheres, remember the left side of the brain saying, go here, say that, do this, go, 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 go. It's the gas pedal. And the right hemisphere is the brake pedal. It regulates everything that the left hemisphere is putting out. So the left hemisphere likes patterns, it likes repetition, it's where impulses come from, it's where happiness, anger, and frustration come from, and it's where short-term focus comes from. So short-term focus is our ability to pay attention to something like YouTube videos or video games. And then again, the right hemisphere balances all of that out. The right hemisphere helps us regulate our emotions, helps us regulate our impulses, our long-term focus, and our ability to think about things more in terms of the big picture and correlate consequences to our actions. All of those are right hemisphere skills. So what happens is when primitive reflexes don't get integrated properly, we start developing sensory and motor and cognition, and we start to develop this delay between the two hemispheres, where for a lot of kids, let's say you have a 10-year-old, your 10-year-old's left hemisphere might be functioning like a 10-year-old, but their right hemisphere starts functioning like a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old. So they have all of this capacity for high intelligence, high impulses, high anger, high literal logical thought, and the ability to regulate all of that at a much lower level like a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, which is why we hear all the time, my child's so smart, he must know better than to do that crazy thing that he just did. But it's not a matter of intelligence, it's a matter of we have this huge delay between the left hemisphere and right hemisphere now. So first of all, we have to get primitive reflexes integrated. Second of all, we have to pull that weaker hemisphere up so it can match and function at the same level as the stronger hemisphere. And as we start to do that, we're going to see executive function, which is things like cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, social understanding, all of those things, all those symptoms that you see your child struggling with that are causing you the most pain in your home, those symptoms will start to decrease and eventually disappear as your child's brain starts to function the way that they're supposed to function, like a neurotypical child their age. So I don't want to make any of that sound too good to be true. This is a long, tedious process. We have lots of case studies below here. I encourage you to watch those videos, listen to the parents of our program, talk about what it's actually been like to go through this process, read their case studies, read their files. For most people, the first signs of change honestly do start to happen relatively quickly. This is a long process and it does take a lot of hard work on your end, which is why we will come alongside of you and be in this process with you as much as you'll let us in. The question here is not, does this work? The question is, are you willing, are you able, are you capable at this point in your life to put in the time, to put in the effort, and let one of us come alongside you and make this the last year that your child has to struggle with these things?
You know, I love the question, does this work? Because it's the main question. Does this work and will it work for my child? Those two questions have literally defined every client relationship I've had in the last 11 years. Because of what we do in the science of neuroplasticity, you have to ask that question. Does it work? Will it work for my child? My question after 11 years is answered. I know it works and I know it worked for my child. The question that remains is, will it work for your child? Will it work for you? And as Jessica was saying, the question is, will you do what's necessary and will you do it long enough? And I just want to double down on that because that is the quintessential difference between a failure and a success in what we do. Can you stick with it long enough and consistently enough to get the results that you know your child wants? Can you stay with it while your child comes into this program and you're ranking their issues at an 8, and then over the course of months or maybe even a year of doing the work consistently on their brain, they become a 2. You rank them as a 2 and their doctor notices a difference. Can you do that? And is it worth it to you to do that? I think when you answer that question honestly, taking the next steps in our process will be very natural to you, which the next step is to fill out the application. Like she said, watch those case studies, watch the videos, read the notes, read the files, and get a sense of what those clients are talking about. And those are real people. We can even facilitate a conversation between you and them, and we're happy to do that. But you need to have that sense, that peace inside, that you've done the due diligence, that you've put in the reading, you've put in the work, and that you have a sense that this is the right step for your child. So the next step is to fill out the application, and then after that, there will be a consultation because we want to make sure that this is the right thing for your family to do at this time so that we can guarantee that you're going to get success. That's the most important thing for us, is at the end of this, your child is functioning the way that you know that they're supposed to. So, fill out the application, and we'll talk to you soon.